Thank you, everyone, and thank you for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew Boden. I was raised in Cranbrook, and I've been writing since my early 20s. So I won't say how many decades that is. I've been published in numerous journals and magazines across Canada. I have 3 books to my name. Co-edited book on mental health issues, a collection of short stories set here in Cranbrook called The Secret History of My Hometown. And most recently I had my debut novel published by Goose Lane Editions, and it's called When We're Ashes, and it was nominated for the Amazon Canada First Novel Award, and was just in Toronto for that ceremony last month. So I've been writing mostly historical fiction, and that's what we'll be talking about tonight. I'm currently working on a novel set in the Spanish Civil War, about 1940, and if we have time, I'll show you a few screenshots from the software I use and show you a bit about my process as well. And so without further ado, I'm going to click the button here and hope the slide advances. This is where I call for help. Thank you. So tonight's program, we're going to talk about the difference between what I call world building. You may have heard that from fantasy and science fiction authors and films and such. And we're mostly going to be talking about historical world building. So I'll tell you a bit about the difference. I'll give you 5 examples from fiction of the sort of thing we'll be looking at. Some key writing concepts, some secrets of historical writing, provide you with those, and then some examples from fiction, so passages from authors you may be familiar with or maybe not. And then we're going to talk about a little bit about some of the research sources I use, fairly general, and then with some examples from my own current work I'm doing. And then along the way, I planned a couple 5-minute writing breaks for each of you to see if you've taken in the concepts and so on or not. No exam, so please don't worry. Alas, it is not working. It says it's on. Yeah, one more, please. You just press the space bar. There we go. So the first concept I'd like to introduce you may have heard it in other venues, world building. You would have heard this probably in fantasy and science fiction context. So the idea is an author or film writer or what have you is creating an entire world. That could be a universe, for example. Think Star Wars. It could be a fantasy world setting. Think Middle Earth from J.R.R. Tolkien. And so that's going to include everything like geography, flora, fauna, the social, political milieu, and so on. So that's world building in general. Tonight we're going to focus on historical world building. So next slide, please. Thank you. So unlike fantasy or science fiction, you're not creating a whole world. You're using this one, you're using its history, and you're using the various layers of its history to tell your story, to engage your audience. in your story, in your characters and plot and so on. So it's still going to include all the sort of things you might find in world building in general, some geographical research, cultural research, maybe even some of the socioeconomic aspects as well. Thank you. So I'll give you 5 examples. You may have heard of some of these. You may not have heard of all of them. The first one is 16th century England in Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall. Excellent novel, very thoroughly researched, really good example of historical writing. Next up, you may have heard of Anthony Doerr's All the Light We Cannot See, which won the Pulitzer Prize in the US. And of course, that is set in World War II era Germany and France. What I like about this one in particular is it's almost like he tells the story so well, the history, the background, the context seems so natural, like you're actually there, which is what you're really aiming for as a writer. Moving to Africa, pre-colonial Nigeria in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, very famous novel. I wouldn't technically call it a historical novel, as I wouldn't the next 2. I'll explain about that in a little bit. So he's writing more in his own contemporary times, but again, you're totally immersed in the history of Nigeria at the time, its people and cultures. Another excellent example of historical writing. The next 2, again, Raymond, if you're into detective fiction, 1930s Los Angeles, so Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe novels. And the last one is 1940s Southern Rhodesia in Doris Lessing's The Grass is Singing. So the last 2 aren't technically historical novels. They were written by contemporary authors on or around the time of their novels, but they're just excellently written, excellent examples of historical writing. Next slide, please. So before we begin with the historical writing part, I wanted to introduce you to a key writing concept by an author and teacher, John Gardner. He wrote a very excellent book called The Art of Fiction. It's probably about 30 or 40 years old now, but for me, a go-to. If you're new to writing, Mr. Gardner can sound like a big know-it-all and make you feel small. Important to overlook that and focus on the information he's providing you. So when I first read it, I thought, I'm never gonna write, this guy's like too smart. But no, I got over that. He's an excellent teacher, excellent writer in his own part. And the concept it's called the fictive dream. And I'll just read you what that is. So this is the idea that fiction does its job by creating a dream state for the reader. And as long as the writer is doing a good job of maintaining that dream state, the reader won't wake up from it and will continue to believe in the fictional world the writer has created. So this generally holds true. If you're writing metafiction, so fiction about fiction, maybe not. If you're trying to get the reader to wake up and realize that he's just reading a book, that's something different. But generally, that's what we want to aim for when we're doing our writing in general and a historical writing, immersing our readers in the text. They're totally immersed in our characters and plot, and time is going by and they're turning page after page. So that's kind of something we want to aim for in our historical writing and writing in general. And we'll talk a bit about how to do that tonight. So next slide. So we're going to talk about some of the secrets to strong world building. One focuses, of course, details. So we want to try to make sure that the reader feels like there's a whole world that's been created, even if you only show a few details of it. So the writer Ernest Hemingway called these iceberg details. So you're seeing the tip of the iceberg, but you're sensing, you're feeling, you're intuiting that there's a lot more below the water going on, undercurrents and subtext of the story. So you want to make sure you try to pick out the right details. And so most importantly, the details should serve the story and not the other way around. You want to make sure you're prioritizing the details based on what your characters, your plot, and so on, and that there aren't too many extraneous details. So sometimes if you've read a lot of 19th century novels, Russian authors like Dostoevsky, you may read a whole 50-page tract in the middle of the novel on some political aspect of Russia and so on. Certainly authors like Dostoevsky writing in the 19th century could get away with that. If I submitted something like that now to my agent or editor, they'd probably wonder what I'm taking and cross it out and have me rewrite it and so on. So you want to make sure you're focusing on the details that serve your plot and your characters. So, sense details, taste, touch, smell, hearing, etc. We talk about the 5 senses. I suspect there's a lot more than that. I don't want to get too woo-woo, but just think of the idea of falling from a height and the feeling you might get in the pit of your stomach. Well, what sense is that? Maybe another one, maybe or not. But when we're talking about details, we're talking about sense details. So things your characters heard or smelled or saw and so on, or touched. And in just a moment, I'll give you some sample passages of authors that I thought have done that particularly well. The other concept to think about is that you don't have to filter all your sense detail through a consciousness. So you don't have to say, I saw, or I heard, or he saw, or he heard, or he smelled. There's this idea, it's called the naming of the parts. And the naming of the parts, which I'll show you in a moment, is you can just describe a scene and evoke that sense detail. So whether that's visual, things you hear, things you smell, and so on. And I'll give you an example in particular from Ernest Hemingway, who was really good at evoking that kind of detail by this concept of the naming of the parts. Thank you. So you may be wondering, well, how much detail? There's a very excellent English writer of historical fiction, Barry Unsworth, and I'll just read what he had to say. So this is a critic who wrote about his style, and I think it's particularly helpful when you're thinking about your own historical writing. So, Unsworth's style is not heaped in historical minutiae. He says, I don't really care how many buttons someone had on his waistcoat. It would be good to get it right. But what really matters is trying to get a hold of the spirit of the age. What it was like to be alive in that age, what it felt like to be an ordinary person in the margins of history. So you want to be able to manage the details that you're incorporating in your fiction, that you're getting, the ones that again are germane to the plot and your characters and so on. And then, of course, you want to avoid sort of just too much extraneous detail, too much minutia that may not advance your plot or story, for example. Thank you. Another secret, anachronism. So these are things, say for example, we're writing something about Cranbrook in the 1900s, and the author says, well, and then this four-wheel drive pickup went by down the street. That's an example of an anachronism, something that doesn't fit the historical period, and something that can jar your reader from the fictive dream, they'll wake up for a bit and wonder, what the heck is a Ford pickup doing in 1900 in Cranbrook? Important that you avoid those things and that you're doing solid research to avoid that. So recently I read a book by an author I know, and it was set in World War II, and I had also studied aspects of World War II for my recent novel, and there was some stuff in there that I knew didn't happen in World War II, bits and pieces of technology and so on. But it kind of jarred me out of the story, and I started to wonder, like, did the writer get their research done well enough that I should keep going on? So you want to avoid your readers having those kind of questions by encountering something that shouldn't fit, like, the Ford pickup in 1900s, early 1900s. Thank you. So I talked earlier about having too much historical detail, too much minutia. There's some caveats, as there is to most things in writing and fiction. So for example, it's kind of going to depend on who your character is. If your character is, we'll say, OCD, they attend to every little detail in their life is just wrapped up in minute details, you're going to be writing more about that, how that character views the world through their own particular lens. You may have characters, a viewpoint character who doesn't care about detail. They'll say, I'm going down the street to so-and-so, rather than the OCD character said, I took 12 steps to the corner, there were 4 cracks in the street, I passed a 1960s Studebaker, etc. So it's going to depend on how your characters view the world. Now that's something to keep in the background as you're doing your research. If you're like me, and you're usually probably over-researching, but that can be helpful. I find it better to over-research than to under-research. And so I have more to draw from when I'm writing. Next slide, thank you. So my first example is actually from a piece of detective fiction. So you may know Raymond Chandler, famous writer of detective fiction, his hero, Philip Marlowe. And I just want to read you a bit in terms of how he described coming to Los Angeles in his novel, The Little Sister. So he says, I smelled Los Angeles before I got to it. It smelled stale and old, like a living room that had been closed too long. But the colored light fooled you. So sense detail, smell. Now in this case, as in the next example, he directly says, I smelled, and sometimes that's very appropriate. But smells can be so powerful and evocative of an age. When I'm writing, for example, my historical fiction, one thing I'm doing is making a list of things characters might smell in the streets or a home or something like that. And that's going to be very different from our own age, for example. So in World War II, just an example, there might have been the smell of a lot of gunpowder, explosions. I was writing about 1940s Germany, so certain food smells and so on can really get the reader into the story and immerse them in the fictive dream of that particular setting. Next slide. So this is Ernest Hemingway from For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is one of his very famous novels about the Spanish Civil War. Hemingway actually was there reporting on it in 1936, 1937, as I recall. So he was on the front lines, and then wrote this novel. So I'll just read out a little passage, and then we'll just talk about it a little bit. So, he rode out of the forest onto the yellow road that led into La Granja. So La Granja is a small town outside of Madrid, and the horses' hooves raised a dust that hung over them as they rode. It powdered the dead, who were tied face down across the saddles, and the wounded. And those who walked beside them were in thick dust. So this is an excellent example of what I talked about, the naming of the parts. So Hemingway isn't saying, I smell dust, or he's saying there's dust, and he repeats the word dust 3 times. And it's very hard not to read that passage and feel the sense detail of it. Everyone's powdered in dry, arid Spanish dust. You can hear those horses' hooves. And though we're not getting a lot of minutia, we're getting an evocative image of bodies tied across horses, covered in dust, and so on. So it's a grim scene. It's a grim scene, but a very evocative scene. And I find what Hemingway is very good at, if you do choose to read him or have read him, is just in a few words, he can capture an entire scene very well. And so that's an example of what I call the naming of, the naming of the parts, rather than filtering the sense detail through a particular consciousness. Next slide. So next is a passage from Doris Lessing, who won the Nobel Prize, I'd say about 10 years ago. And this is from her first novel, The Grass is Singing. It's an excellent novel. I actually just finished reading it about 6 weeks ago. She wrote it in, I want to say 1950, and so the setting is her experience in southern Rhodesia in the 1940s. Very different culture from ours. So, she says of her character, she looked away over the trees, which were dingy and brownish, over the acres of shining grass to the hills. They were hazy and indistinct. The veldt fires had been burning for weeks all around, and she could taste the smoke on her tongue. Sometimes a tiny fragment of charred grass fell on her skin and left a greasy black smudge. So some things about that, of course, is we're getting the taste of what are called the veldt fires. And a veldt, for those of you who don't know, is basically the African plain, think dried grasses and so on, that the farmers often burn every year before planting, or end up burning of their own accord. So that's a detail. If you're writing about southern Rhodesia and you're a farmer, as this character is in the 1940s, you want to make sure that you're researching things like, you know, every year they burn the veldt so they can replant and so on. And that's going to evoke certain sense detail. That's going to evoke certain sights, sounds, and even the taste on the tongue of the burning fires. Just before I go on, any questions about any of that? I don't want to lose anyone. I'm throwing a lot at you in a short period of time. There'll be time for questions at the end as well. Okay. Silence is consent, I take it. So we're at a 5-minute writing break. So what I'd like you to do, if you're so inclined, we have some pens and paper around. Think of 5 details that would convince us we're in this room in 1900. So we'll just pretend that the Cranbrook History Centre was here in 1900, and think of 5 details that would capture that for us, and use as many of your 5+ senses as you can, and we'll just take 5 minutes to do that. And if any of you are like, Andrew, history writing's really boring, I want to write about the future. If you want to convince us we're in this room in the year 2500, happy if you do that as well, using sense detail, of course. Okay, thank you. How was that? And would anyone care to be brave and share some of their thoughts, what they may have come up with? You're not obligated, but I'm happy to hear. Janice.
The smell of horses were faded as the doors closed behind me with a clang. The ballroom already buzzing with excitement as the queen had yet to arrive. The wish of hoop skirts and the click of stiff shoes on the wooden floor added to the anticipation. Evening light almost faded from the sky outdoors, and the light in the room dimmed before the workers lit the smelly gas lights in their sconces. "She's here," someone said, and the murmur of anticipated increasing sound of the echoing room, and muffled conversations ceased.
Janice, have you written before? That was great. Thank you. That was really good. Yeah.
I said that to your next novel. I don't know what the public talking about 1900.
Anyone else? Don't feel intimidated.
Well, the first thing that came to my mind was, oh man, I had to do a lot of research to figure out what kind of way it is. But as you start thinking about it, as I started thinking about it, I was thinking about just the whole architecture and imagining the room filled with people, travelers, the train whistle, in the background, all aboard, can't get aboard, get a blanket.
Yeah.
Clothing,
Mm-hmm.
maybe smoke from people smoking.
Yeah.
Children running around. I'm not too sure what they would be wearing, but I imagine, bonnets and bustles and,
Yeah.
made me think. But
No.
it also made me realize how ignorant I am of the period.
Well, that's perfect. I mean, I sprang it on you, but your imagination is already getting you to engage in what it might have been like. So, for example, yesterday Cheryl and Piper took me on a tour of the trains, and there's smoking cars, and the rooms, some of the rooms kind of smell like Raymond Chandler's Los Angeles and so on. So evoking that kind of detail immerses your reader in the fictive detail. And Janice, your piece was great. Anyone else? Please.
The dark wood paneled walls smelled of stale cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. The silence hid raucous brawls and wounded manhood. Among the shouts for calm and order, the sheriff gulped a frothy, mostly warm beer, wiping lips of foam across the rough woolen forearm of his old faded red tunic, a remnant of past disputes.
I like it. I like it. Thank you. Anyone else before we? Please.
Sure, I'm like you, I'm sure my historical detail is wrong, but the windows and doors rattled as the train braked and squealed out of the station. The doors were open, so the dense, oily smell of coal sifted along the floor below the puffs of steam that made my hair coil tighter and the ringlets along my cheeks.
Very good. I like it. So one thing to remember with these things, it's very easy to get down on ourselves that we haven't researched the period, or maybe we're not as experienced as some writers. But part of building your confidence as a writer and a historical writer is simply taking those risks and writing some and building from it. So I wouldn't talk yourself into lack of confidence. When I started writing, I can assure you, there's no way I would have imagined myself up here talking about writing when I was 23. It's just, it would have been paralyzing. But I got over myself. Next slide. Thank you, everyone. That was great. So the other, and we talked a bit about sense details and so on, but in terms of historical writing, and even if you're considering world building like fantasy or sci-fi, so think again, you may have heard of Frank Herbert's Dune, the planet Arrakis, for example. Very strong sense of the culture of the Fremen on the planet Arrakis, their religion, their traditions, and so on. You completely believe that there's this world somewhere out in space called Arrakis, and with this whole different culture on it. When we're talking about historical world building, we want to make sure that we're capturing the social, religious, political, and economic systems that are structured a certain way for particular reasons. So you want to be able to identify those reasons. So for example, when we'll look at an example from Doris Lessing's Southern Africa. There's obvious, there's this oppressive relationship between black and white people. It has historical reasons for that, reasons that most modern people wouldn't agree with. But if you're writing in that period, you want to capture that context and capture that cultural milieu. So we want to understand those social structures and try to picture the rules that help shape those systems. And those rules will shape the decisions you make about your characters and the events that impact your plot. Next slide, please. So, for example, say you were writing historical fiction about Persia in 550 AD. If you had a female character, for example, you likely wouldn't have her wearing shorts and fighting everyone she comes across, because the culture then was particularly, I'll say, different for women, oppressive for women, they had fewer choices and so on. But if you're setting a female character in that milieu, for example, you want to know what a woman at that time of a particular class would have been facing in the culture. That said, if there's a good explanation that your character, your female character, is a scimitar-wielding heroine, you just want to make sure you understand that the structure she normally operates in may not permit that, and how would you adjust your plot and your characters to make that work, make it believable, and keep your readers immersed in the fictive dream. Next, please. So, some sample questions to consider when you're thinking of social structure, social context, social rules. How did different religious groups, class structures, and ethnicities feel about each other? So I talked about Southern Africa, 1940, relationship between black and whites, very different than it is today, for example. How did their feelings influence their political and judicial decisions? So for example, if we're thinking of a female character in 550 AD in Persia, and she murders a man, what are the implications of that in the judicial setting of the time and the culture of the period, and how would we reflect that in our story? Was there any separation of church and state, for example? Separation of church and state. I'll say, I mean, obviously there are many times historically where they weren't separated, and there was a lot of, shall we say, controversy about that, and fighting and infighting and so on. So that's another question to think about. And then, were there more conflicts than times of peace, for example? For example, 16th century England, we're thinking of Hilary Mantel, not exactly a peaceful period of history, would have been reflected in the readiness to war, the raising of armies, and conflicts between different factions, for example. Next slide. So first slide, first example is from Pride and Prejudice. And for the women in the audience, I don't mean to pick on how women were treated in earlier times. I just thought this was a very good example because people may know Pride and Prejudice. So here, Jane Austen satirizes the social conventions of her era, revealing the limited options to women and the societal pressures that govern their lives. So for example, the character Mrs. Bennet, she's very keen on finding husbands for her daughters because, of course, the economic power that was available to women, the opportunities for them were very limited. So if you were Jane Austen, and it's by no means she was writing a contemporary novel, of course, but if you're a modern reader now, you get a strong sense of the history and the social and political rules that divided men and women. So she can write something like this. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So that's 19th century social and political structure for women. Obviously very different from today. It goes without saying that women have a lot more opportunities today, a lot more socioeconomic status. And it would be bizarre if you were a writer to write something like that today and have it taken seriously. The point is, if you're writing about a particular period, you want to know what the social rules and structure is and operate within it and if you do break those rules and structure, have a very good reason for doing so. Next slide. So next is Doris Lessing, again from The Grass is Singing. So we have the divide between white and black South Africans is stark, oppressive, and certainly to a modern reader, more than unsettling. In the scene I'm going to read from, a black servant named Moses is trying to help the ill white woman for whom he works. And this is what Doris writes. Then he carefully took the glass from her, put it on the table, and seeing that she stood there dazed, not knowing what to do, said, "Madam, lie down on the bed." She did not move. He put out his hand reluctantly, loath to touch her, the sacrosanct white woman, and pushed her by the shoulder. She felt herself gently propelled across the room towards the bedroom. Now, in the modern age, of course, this does not make a lot of sense, but if we're writing a novel about 1940s South Africa, we want to make sure that we have an understanding, as Doris Lessing does, who experienced all this, of the social and political structure at the time. And very unfortunately, to a modern reader, that's divided along lines of ethnicity, even producing rules about who can touch whom and when. So the point is that when you're doing your research, you're getting those kind of details. There's a social and political set of rules. We need to understand them, work within them, and if we do break them, and they do break here, how does that affect the plot and the characters and the development of the story? Next slide. Another writing break, 5 minutes. So think again of Cranbrook in the 1900s, early 1900s, and then come up with 2 or 3 examples of how the social rules and structure may be different from today. And again, if you're like Andrew, I don't want to write about the history of Cranbrook, and you want to write about the future, tell me how it might be different in the year 2500, different social and political rules. Very good hint again on the little tour of the trains that Cheryl and Piper took me on. Rules and structure were built right into the architecture of the trains, and it's absolutely fascinating details. So 5 minutes and 2 or 3 examples of how the social rules and structure may be different in the year 1900. So how was that for everyone? And is anyone brave enough to want to share what they came up with? Sure, thank you.
The crowded train platform suddenly parted like the Red Sea to reveal a stunning, majestic Kanaha chief Isidore. The women's faces revealed shock and disdain for the perceived invasion of the first-class waiting area. A Chinese porter hurried up to the chief, offering a guiding hand away. Several gentlemen could be heard uttering slurs and demanding he be jailed forthwith.
Unfortunately, yes. Yeah. When I did the research for my collection of short stories, and was doing some research at the archive for the Columbia Basin Institute, I was just shocked by what was in the paper about, various ethnicities and so on. So that captures certainly what I was reading very well. Thank you. Anyone else? Piper.
The afternoon breeze jostled the impenetrable gowns of Cranbrook's fairs, threatening the structure of their meticulously arranged upstairs, and carrying the thick clouds of smoke billowing from the men's hall, where their husbands remained, directly in their compound's path.
That's really good, thank you. When Cheryl and Piper took me on a tour of the train, I was shocked how the structure of society for men and women was reflected in the architecture. So the men's washrooms, they had these nice leather couches they could sit side by side on. And the women's, they had chairs, they all faced away from each other. And as Cheryl said, this was to reduce chatter amongst women. And it was just like a shocking detail of women's discourse was thought of in like 1929 and so on. So that's really good, thank you. Anyone else? Anyone do anything from? No.
I'm wondering maybe because I can hear her chuckling because my brain's completely blank and she's chuckling.
She rode into town on a chestnut mare, guns holstered and a shotgun across the saddle. Her breeches and boots didn't exactly fit with the genteel women in the station, but she didn't care much. She was there for a package and to see the assayer, and she was used to fighting for herself. After all, there were a lot of no good fellows up there in the hills ready to take what they wanted, including her claim. Being a woman was no advantage without a load of buckshot ready to fire.
Right on.
So that's great. Like you're defying the conventions that are on the train, and I got a real strong image of who this woman was, and I wouldn't want to cross paths with her. But there's that having to fight for your independence in a society at the time that didn't permit that. So I think that's brilliant. And it's not silly by any means. Thank you. Anyone else before we move on? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Cheryl. Research ideas and resources. I'll cover this very quickly. We could do a whole session on just this. Obviously, your local library. I used to work at Simon Fraser University Library, and it's just a wealth of information. Befriending your librarian, whether they're at the Cranbrook Public Library or the University College Library here, wealth of information and wealth of research help. Next, please. Online research. So I mentioned, for example, when I was researching Cranbrook, the Internet Archives from the Columbia Basin Institute, wealth of information, newspaper articles, and photos and so on, which I found very evocative. We'll talk a bit about photos in a minute. Next, please. Photography and film collections for more modern historical research. That's been super helpful, whether I was writing about Cranbrook's history from the late 1800s until the present, my research for my novel in World War II, or even what I'm, what I'm researching now for the Spanish Civil War, photographs, period films, which you can find. Very evocative, very helpful for helping you capture some of the details. Next, please. Books and films about the period you're researching. I just had a writing residency in Switzerland for a month, and my luggage was just mostly books I'd ordered from the university library and so on. I still haven't got myself a Kindle or something. I just find the books, whether it's authors at the time, films about the time period, books by biographers, by academics and so on, hugely helpful for my research, highly recommended. And then last, interviews with academics and other sources of historical knowledge. So that could be if you're researching things indigenous, so knowledge keepers within your indigenous communities. Very lucky, I'm still at Simon Fraser University, so for example, my book set in World War II, there's a World War II historian, one floor up, who helped me immensely with research and even read my manuscript to help me make sure I got the details correct. So very helpful if you can meet those people, even at a distance. Just introduce yourself to a professor or something like that via email, explain what you're looking for, and 9 times out of 10 you're going to get a wealth of helpful information and guidance. Next slide. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I should have plugged you. My apologies. So I'm just going to give you a personal example, both the software I'm using and recent examples of my own historical research into the Spanish Civil War. So I don't use MS Word or anything like that anymore. I use a program called Scrivener. I think you can subscribe to it for about $30 a year. What I really like about it, it has templates for writing novels, poetry, screenplays, stage plays, etc. And it has a built-in research function into it. So everything is in the same place. I have folders for my various researches I'll show you in a minute. Very handy. It can all be easily imported. Web pages can be brought in and so on. Very useful for organizing your writing. Next slide. A little blurry, at least from my angle. Maybe you can see it better than I can. No, that's okay. So it has this, as you can see here, it has what's called a corkboard feature, and you can just stick research items onto it, which get listed into the left-hand column. I have folders for research, character development, the manuscript, ideas for imagery that occur to me, and so on. So for example, I have highlighted here, there's a song by the British band The Clash, a song called Spanish Bombs. It's all about the Spanish Civil War. And it occurred to me, I snagged the lyrics and thought, well, maybe, you know, the chorus might be the epigram to my novel, for example. So even little things like that can help flesh out your novel. Next slide. So as I said, you can import right into the program. You'll see highlighted on the left, I just have an entry from Wikipedia, Picasso's painting Guernica, which was about the bombing of Guernica by the German Air Force, who were aiding the fascist forces in Spain. Again, sometimes I pick up small details from the things I'm researching. In this case, it's the very painting itself, which is metaphorically capturing through very Spanish imagery, the horse, the bull, etc., the suffering of the people in the town of Guernica when it was bombed. Next slide, please. So we have here, these are just on my corkboard, all the books I've been reading about the Spanish Civil War. You'll see on the side here, I've just made lists of notes of things that grab my attention and are details that I may incorporate into the book itself. So for example, the local police drove blue vans. Very small detail, but I thought, well, if one of my characters gets arrested, a blue van is going to show up. Gives it a little authenticity, gives you the idea that this author at least thinks he knows what he's talking about when he's writing about Spain, for example. And then over here, I just have a list of details that just grab me and that I may incorporate, I may not, but they're handy to have. Next slide, please. So, and one of the things I find so helpful, particularly from a modern time period, are photos. And there's a huge number of photos of things like World War II, First World War, Spanish Civil War. Here we have two little girls in the city of Madrid. They're taking shelter as the nationalist forces are bombing Madrid. And it's a striking photo and probably a story in itself. We have the two girls, they're holding hands, they're consoling each other. They're obviously looking out for planes or something like that. So if you come across photos that can be immensely evocative of the time period, give you an idea how people dressed, hairstyles and so on, if that's going to be incorporated into your novel. If we're talking about a period before photography, I go straight to art. I go to paintings of the time period. Can be very evocative too. You just have to remember that paintings were often commissioned by rich patrons to capture rich people on a painting. So you want to take some thoughts about that, because even the idea of painting people who were from lower classes was not always a practice that occurred. I think, next slide, please. Questions, your questions. I'm happy to talk about anything. I know I crammed several hours into an hour, but I'm happy to take any questions.
You were mentioning you were using song lyrics from Flash.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with the copyright on the song lyrics?
So as an epigram, I can get away with a little bit at the beginning of the novel without having to get permission. If I didn't need permission, whichever publisher I'm using, they usually arrange that for me. If the song lyrics are in your story, you would probably have to get permission from whoever the holder of the copyright was.
So if you're using a phrase from a song, you shouldn't use that.
Well,
There's no place like home or...
yeah, so here's what I would do. I would certainly incorporate it into your text, and when you're done and you have an agent or an editor, you just note, here are song lyrics from this song, do I need copyright permission, do I not? And then, like my publisher did that for me.
You got permission.
Yeah.
I mean, that's great if you have a publisher, but whatever you're self-published. I don't know when it needs copyright.
If you're self-publishing, you might want to do a little research, or contact an author or another publishing company and just say, how much of a song lyric that's copyrighted to someone else can I incorporate before I have to seek permission? Yeah.
I was curious what kind of a laptop or a computer you use for your scribbler.
Well, there's my little Mac laptop there. Yeah, and then at home I have a desktop, a Mac desktop, and Scrivener can be used on either Mac or non-Mac platforms. Yeah, very helpful.
Great program.
Yeah, I've totally switched. I write poetry on it. I'm working on some plays and so on. So it's all there in one package. Anyone else? Questions, concerns, witty quips?
For all of the background, backstory for the new book that I'm working on, I use ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm. And how do you find that?
Excellent.
And do you trust it?
Well, here's the thing, because I'm writing fiction,
Mhm.
I don't care.
Now, now I've heard of AIs hallucinating, and large language models are only as good as the data that's online, and if the data online is wrong.
And here's the thing that I find quite ironic is that human beings can hallucinate.
Yeah, of course.
So, and human beings create
Mm-hmm.
large language models. So
Yeah,
by extension, could suggest that hallucination can be passed along.
no, absolutely. I think you're right, but I was just wondering if your experience, are you noticing any glitches, anything that was an anachronism would pull the reader out of the fictive dream I was talking about?
Not really, I guess, and I have very limited experience using it, so
Okay.
it's kind of focused on what I wanted to pull.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good. That's good.
So it doesn't have to, because my book is the historical accuracy of the past is really not germane to the story.
Yeah, then I think it could be very helpful then. That's good.
Yeah, that's fascinating too.
Yeah, I haven't used it yet myself for historical research. I still have some questions in my little brain about it, but if you can make it work, I think that's good. Yeah. Anyone else? Questions? Yes?
What's the difference between historical world building and what we know now as historical fiction?
Not a lot. When I'm talking historical world building, I'm talking about one part of historical fiction writing. So instead of just character development or plot development, I'm talking about the setting, what you might call the setting as historical world building. Yeah. Anyone else? Questions? Well, thank you, everyone. If you do have, if you're the sort of person who doesn't like to ask questions during the event, you can write to me at andrewboden.com. I have my contact information is there. Happy to hear from you. And thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for the gift of your time. Thank you.
Thank you.